And we are live.
Great. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Nils Andreasen. I'm the Executive Director of the Alaska Municipal League, and happy to be co-hosting this discussion series with AARP, and Marge Stone King there will give a brief introduction too on their role, but a little bit about why AML is talking about revenues. And for those of you unfamiliar with the Alaska Municipal League, we do work with and for 165 cities and boroughs. And one of our priorities this year, as it has been so many years in the past, is a state that's addressed its structural budget deficit. And we know that based on underfunding over the years and unfunded aspects of that budget, revenues are really crucial to right the ship and to make sure that costs aren't shifted to local governments and others this and coming years. Alaska's local governments depend on a healthy state government that can pay for not just the state, but for the things that its residents depend on. So the collaboration with AARP is really an opportunity for us to dive a little bit deeper into revenue. Last week, we talked a little bit about what are the different revenue options that are out there. This week, we'll be talking about oil revenues, and in the coming weeks, we'll be looking at other revenue sources and then income and sales taxes. And our goal throughout is to have a discussion to have participants, including legislators, talk through kind of what are the politics, what are the considerations involved with each of these discussions, and to at least highlight the questions and issues that are out there for us all to be better understanding of kind of what's at stake and ways forward. So Marge, maybe you would give a brief introduction to AARP as well.
Sure. So AARP is a nonprofit, nonpartisan member organization with over 75,000 members in Alaska, working to promote the health and well-being of older Alaskans so that they can choose how and where they live as they age. So we know that older Alaskans are very civically engaged, and voting among the 50 plus is significantly higher than any other age group. The 50 plus population in Alaska also has higher rates of volunteering and charitable giving, and accounts for more than half of consumer spending in Alaska. And most of us want to stay here in Alaska. We are the fastest growing senior population in the country. We want to stay in Alaska, and it's good for seniors to stay in Alaska. And so we're happy to partner with AML on this series because their goal is for people to be able to stay in their communities as well. And the work of the Alaska legislature that we're here to talk about today is critical to ensuring that older Alaskans and all Alaskans can remain in their communities, and that older folks can age here safely and affordably. So when we surveyed our AARP members on state fiscal solutions earlier this year, there was strong agreement, regardless of geography or party affiliation, in opposition to continued state budget cuts and in support of revenue solutions, which is why we're co-hosting this Revenue Solutions series. Our research shows that older Alaskans are keenly aware of the state fiscal challenges and are willing to do their part to ensure a sustainable Alaska for future generations by supporting a broad-based tax as part of a comprehensive fiscal solution. But most relevant to our conversation today, 68% of AARP members surveyed support increasing taxes on oil and gas companies. And the majority of our members at 51% strongly support that. So we found wide margins of 2 to 1 or greater across all regions, member age groups, and income levels. And so that's why we're interested in this conversation today. Thanks, Nils.
Thank you, Marge. We have two participants today, and Tim Bradner is joining us, as well as Representative Andy Josephson. For those of you who are viewing this session online, you should be able to ask questions through the Q&A function. And Katie Severin with AARP will help us field those questions and moderate that process. But again, I think for Tim and Representative Josephson, this is something of a dialogue. I'd like to invite each of you to provide some opening remarks. And Tim, since I just asked you to be part of this yesterday, I'm going to start with you. You've had less time to think of it, but also you've been writing about natural resource development since 10 years before I was born. I feel like I can count on you to talk a little bit about what does this conversation mean to you, to Alaska? What has it meant to Alaska policymakers? Can you give us some of that context and help set the stage? And then I'll turn to Representative Josephson to give his perspective.
Yes, Niels, I'd be happy to. Let me just sort of open with a little bit of my background. I do the Legislative Digest. It's a legislative report, and we do the Alaska Economic Report also. But pertinent to this subject, I've been writing about oil taxes for years. And just in full disclosure, I worked for BP for many years, from 1970 till 1985, in fact, and included in my career with BP was a period as a lobbyist in Juneau working on oil taxes. So I've got a long familiarity with this. I don't really consider myself an expert, but just over the years, I've accumulated enough knowledge about to be halfway smart about at least the terminology and some things. Maybe the most useful thing I can do is to just make a couple of remarks. We've gone through literally years and years and even decades of debate over oil taxes. When the North Slope oil fields first came online, there were big questions by the legislature about the structure. Do we have a fair structure? Are we getting our fair share? And the pendulum swung back and forth, and we had long sessions on oil taxes. And particularly starting about 2010, it seemed like every year there was major oil tax session on the agenda. And until 2013, when there was finally a major changes made, it seemed like we went into special session mode, just like we're doing now in the fiscal package. We did the same thing back in 2013, 2011, even 2006. There were extra special sessions during the summer just dealing with oil taxes. So it's a subject that probably a lot of people in Juneau, except perhaps Andy, have not had to deal with in recent years. So it's going to be a new learning curve for a lot of legislators. Nils, if I can just make a couple more introductory remarks too. When we talk about oil taxes, we must remember that part of the state's revenue comes from a royalty, which is the state landowner share, and that's fixed by contract. So we're really not talking about that so much today, although royalty issues are important to the state and to the permanent fund, which supplies revenue. When we talk about taxes, we mostly focus on the state production tax, which can be changed by statute and has been frequently over the years. And it gets pretty arcane, but the debate really boils down to is kind of, are we getting a fair share? Did we give away too much in 2013 when we changed the tax system to try to attract more industry investment? And then finally, one last point I'll touch on is that the petroleum, this is not a particularly, I guess it's never a good time or a bad time to change the taxes on the industry, but it is true that right now is not a great time. Our industry is not in good shape. The industry was really beat up badly when oil prices collapsed in 2015 and slowly recovered, but the industry never really quite got its mojo back. And then the pandemic, Clement, the collapse of oil markets, the collapse of prices, really again clobbered the industry. And I just want to point out that right now oil prices are rising again. Some drilling is slowly coming back on the slope. Our oil and gas industry employment is now about 6,000 people, and that's the lowest it has been in years. it's less than half of what it was in 2015 before the oil price collapses. So the drilling is slowly coming back, but the hiring is not yet back. And I think the industry is just being very cautious about spending money, putting new drill rigs back to work, which is what really employs people. And so we've got some challenges, including declining production in the North Slope fields. So having set the stage, I don't know how optimistic that sounds, but I'd be happy to answer questions later.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tim. And I guess just to your point about some of that history, I'm looking back on it, it sounds like you mentioned some of these, but the ELF was kind of in place, but before 2005, and then there was this very quick series of changes, or every year or a few, to how the state approached oil taxation. The PPT in 2006, ACEs in 2007, Cook and the Recovery in 2010, and 13 was SB 21. So it really was kind of this, it seems like, rapid population of trying to figure out fair share or the state's share of all of these. Is that right? Or is that kind of what you were saying?
There's so many changes, Niels, that they all blur after a while. We could get into some weeds on this if there are questions, but I will tell you that this quickly gets complicated to the eyes glaze over quickly. So to the extent I can answer questions, I'm going to try to keep the concepts and terminology so we don't get into jargon and too much deeply into the details.
Perfect. And probably I shouldn't go tossing around acronyms, but there's a lot to it, I know. Representative Josephson, thanks for joining us. Can you maybe introduce yourself and help us think through what this looks like from your perspective? You've been through many of those conversations and are here today to be thinking too about where the state's at. How do you approach that?
Thank you, Niels, and thanks to your listeners and for putting on this forum. I'm Andy Josephson. I flew in from Juneau back to my hometown of Anchorage. I'm a lifelong Alaskan. I've lived around the state, twice in rural Alaska, and I'm in my 9th year in the legislature. I know enough about this subject to be dangerous. That's selling myself a little bit short. I know, I was thinking there's 60 of us in the legislature. Some of the folks that knew a lot about this issue have left. Les Guerra was one of them. But probably I'm in sort of the top 10 in terms of my knowledge of the issue, just from exposure and time. And I was co-chairman of the Resources Committee during some recent reforms. The one thing I think I would really want you to leave with is this. At the peak of production and price, the industry paid for 90% of our state expenses as a government. And of course, that meant that trickles down to the local government as well, through what's called property and equipment tax, where they can tax. It's sort of akin to taxing our homes with a mill rate and a property valuation. It's sort of in that family of taxation. That 90%, of course, understandably got everyone's attention because it was just so impressive and so important. That number is now around 30% and declining. So when the industry, and I'm not an opponent of the industry at all, but when the industry says, you need to listen to us, you need to appreciate us, and you need to really understand us, that's still true, but it just isn't as true. And that's because of the permanent fund. Now, interestingly, the permanent fund, most of its wealth was derived from oil and gas, oil. So there's a linkage there still, but most of our expenses, about 70%, are paid from recurring revenue from the permanent fund itself. And so the oil industry just, don't get me wrong, as Tim said, there are a huge number of jobs and they're some of our best jobs. And 30% or 35% is still a lot, but it just isn't, it isn't king anymore. And it's not to blame the oil industry, it just is a fact. I could talk about the history of this as well and talk about some recent reforms. Neil's absolutely got the timeline right. One thing I would note is the industry doesn't like reform efforts, but it's noteworthy that some of the things that have happened have been the industry's request. So some of these things, principally SB 21, was the industry's request. And by the way, they made requests this year through the governor's office so that there's an expanded kind of royalty relief. And I'm trying to remember the details, but it's a kind of royalty relief. And what that means is, well, it's relief from royalty. So, you know, you've got a royalty payment and they wanted, the administration, I'm sure the industry asked for it, they wanted to expand opportunities to reduce royalty payments for challenged fields. So yes, there have been reformers who sought more revenue and what we deem as more fairness, but some of these efforts have been oil industry led. And I'm ready to talk about new efforts. There's been an expanded coalition right now today of people, including conservative Republicans, who I think would sign on to them. And here we're talking about something called the per barrel credit. And we can talk about what that is. But there's probably, you know, if you're wondering what's the sweet spot, where might the legislature collectively agree on reform? It probably concerns the per barrel credit, which is an SB 21, that's 2013 Senate Bill 21 feature. And what's at issue there is, depending on price, perhaps a couple $100 million. That would be shifting $200 million from the industry to the state. That's just what that means. There are other people that would want to be more ambitious. I think Senator Wielechowski is one of them. And they would want a wholesale change and basically repeal of Senate Bill 21, which was a Parnell era oil industry driven largely reform. And so I could go on and on, but I'll stop there and see where we go.
Well, just remind folks that you can put your questions in the Q&A box if you're on Zoom or in the chat on Facebook Live under the comments. And just to clarify, are you saying, Rep. Josephson, that there is an appetite in the legislature to repeal the tax credit?
I was almost going to say through the chair. There is an appetite to reform the per barrel credit. And essentially, after you've deducted the costs of pulling the oil out of the ground and shipping it to Washington State or California, which is normally where it goes, you end up with a profit. And that's the profit you tax. And Tim can correct me if I've got the order wrong. But the last thing after deriving what that profit is a further reduction based on, it's a chart, if you will, or a formula that links to the price and then gives a corresponding per barrel deduction. And that per barrel deduction varies from $0 to $8. It's at $8 at lower prices and $0 at very high prices. And that should sort of be intuitive to the listeners. You want to give a hand, you want to help where the prices are lower. But the question with the per barrel credit has always been, if you were going to do this anyway, why do you need an incentive? And the analogy I came up with is I don't need normally, although it's nice to have discounts and coupons, I'm going to buy milk and I don't need someone to incentivize my purchase of milk. I'm just going to buy it. And so that's I think a decent analogy. Were they going to drill this oil anyway? And the answer to your question, Mark, is yes. There are Republicans like very conservative Mike Shower of the Matsu who have talked about reforming per barrel credits.
Thanks. Tim, anything you would add or expand on? I think the credit discussion, I mean, is kind of front and present right now in front of the legislature. But Tim, I'll go to you, and then Katie, we'll check in with you and see if there are questions that folks have. Tim?
Well, you know, the whole discussion about SB 21 was several years ago, and the memory fades over the years as just to what the justifications and what the rationale was behind. I do recall that there was a, you know, the SB 21 reforms were intended to change the situation we had prior to that with a tax law that was just called ACES. It stood for Alaska's Clear and Equitable Share or something like that, which came out in 2008 or 2009. And that created a lot of problems for the companies, partly because it was so complicated that they couldn't model it. They couldn't figure out what their, surprisingly as it is, they could not figure out what their tax liability was. You know, Repsol, a company that came here in 2012 or 2013 to make major investments, and they wound up doing this, but they confessed to the Department of Revenue that they could not figure out how the ACES law worked. It was just too complicated. So partly the SB 21 reforms, and I'm not an advocate for or against them, but they were intended to simplify and make it more predictable. But the problem with this stuff is that any change in the tax code kind of makes it more complicated. And that's why the per barrel tax credit, it's very difficult to explain the rationale behind it. I remember that there was one at the time, and I listened to it in committee meetings, but now I can't remember what it was. And the difficulty, I'm sure we're going to hear about it again, but the difficulty is going to be explaining this in terms that ordinary people can understand. And by that, I mean legislators who are just ordinary people also. So the industry in defending that is going to have a tough road to hoe. Just one further point I'll make is that when we talk about different kinds of oil tax changes, it affects different segments in the industry. Some of these changes affect small independent companies. Some affect major producers. The per barrel tax credit affects major producers because it's a tax credit on production. But some of the other changes, like we've all heard about the exploration tax credits, and Andy referred to the adjustments to the royalty. Those are really aimed at benefiting small independent companies who are exploring up here. And of course, we want to encourage those companies, but we have to remember that the industry has different components to it, and the different tax regimes affect different parts of the industry differently. In any event, I don't know whether I've clarified or muddied it further.
Yeah.
Easy to muddy this issue.
Yeah. No, I think that's helpful, Tim. And one observer notes that the per barrel deduction was to create progressivity, right? There's a flat 35% tax within SB 21, and the per barrel credit creates progressivity within the system. It's also important to note maybe that price was different then, right? And we were operating, in a very different price environment, and that affects how decision makers view these things. I know, Katie, any questions that have come in from anybody online?
Hi, Nils. Sure. Well, since Tim brought it up, I can turn to a question that we received from online. Can you help us understand the debate about tax credits? What are they on a basic level, and how do they work?
Do you mean the exploration tax credits, Katie, or the production tax credits?
So I was actually thinking exploration, but it doesn't specify.
Well, let me just talk about that for a minute, because that's become very controversial in recent years also. Many years ago, we decided that we were going to offer tax credits mainly for explorers, to get companies, give them an incentive to go out and drill wells and take chances. And so we offered different kinds of credits. It seemed like over the years, And these were mostly benefiting small companies. The major producing companies didn't really, actually were not too interested in these. It was mainly the small independents. And it seemed like every year they would come back with more creative ideas about things, ornaments that they could hang on this tree. And each one got it more complicated to the point that we actually were cashing out these credits and paying cash for them, where the state was actually spending money and subsidizing the cost of wells. And in 2016, Governor Walker stopped that. 2016 and 2017, Governor Walker stopped that. And of course, he did it in such a way it created some hardships for companies. But the bottom line is we're no longer doing that. We're no longer paying cash for tax credits. We're allowing, for some period after that, we're allowing the credits that have accumulated to be taken against production for companies that have production. But in any sense, we did that. There is some feeling that it resulted in some new discoveries. Nobody really knows how much oil or gas was discovered. The resurrection of natural gas production in Cook Inlet is somewhat credited to the tax credits, which were a different specialized series of tax credits were targeted just at Cook Inlet. And our Cook Inlet gas fields were running down at the time. And it's argued that they helped increase exploration and resulted in more gas being found in Cook Inlet, which keeps the lights on. But the per barrel tax credits were a bit different. They were simply a reduction allowance allowed to producers. And it was part of an effort to kind of levelize and equalize the tax burden across several different price categories. So again, it's a complex area. I'm well past the point of remembering how to explain it if I ever could. And I'm sure in the upcoming session, there's going to be a lot of discussion over it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that helps.
Representative, one of the things that Tim brought up is, well, I mean, I think for both exploration or production, there's a reason to have tax policy in place, not just to fund some portion of government, but to incentivize, and for instance, potentially incentivize more production or more exploration. Or can you speak to that? Because I mean, in your opening remarks too, it's clear that oil revenue is less as a percentage of the state's budget, but potentially it's just as important to Alaska's economy. How does the state think about those things, or how do legislators think about those two things? Can you help us think through that?
Well, as Tim said a number of minutes ago, the oil industry, for many of us, with the exception of the Exxon Valdez, it's been a boon to the state. It's been a net positive, and that's an understatement. It's helped us build the Performing Arts Center and build new high schools and pay good retirement and all the rest, and provides good jobs. And so we're aware of that. We'd rather not get in the way. There are people, and this can happen during good times. By that, I mean sort of the 2009 era when prices were high, but also in rougher times, who are adamant that we get our share because God gave us this oil and it's on our land, or sometimes federal land, and we're entitled to that. But what I was really saying is that because the amount we produce is now under 500,000 barrels, in 1989 it was 2 million barrels, and because prices are lower, we just can't rely on it, and no one's to blame. We would like to see more production. The governor has a forecast, and the Fiscal Policy Working Group, which you may have read about in August, relied on production number, I think, of 560,000 barrels, which the Department of Natural Resources is hoping for, so that production may go up. But we have to be realistic about what we're going to derive from the oil industry. And there are a handful of legislators, I'm not one of them, who believe that, and when I say handful, I mean like two maybe, who believe that we could, if we were aggressive in sort of an ACES 2007 framework, we could get all our needs met from the industry. I don't believe that to be true. I think that would do harm to the industry. I think that what's being considered, and this relates to Marge's question, is could it be part of a collective response to our fiscal crisis? And what you're seeing is some belief that yes, it could be part of the reform package. But understand that in my worldview, and I think there's evidence for it, we need, if you want a large dividend, you need $1 billion to $1.5 billion. And, you know, 300 million is a fifth of that, right? So, so it would be part of a response that might include broad-based taxes, some government cuts, although we've made a lot of those, and, you know, assorted other ideas to get us where we need to go. And dividend reform, absolutely, dividend reform would be part of that.
Right. Thank you. Katie, other questions that have come up, or I can?
Sure, Representative Josephson, I think you kind of touched on this question, but I want to acknowledge it. Just why maybe is this still part of the conversation, given the changed environment around the industry? And then, you know, connected to that is another question that I received from online, which I'll kind of fold in. What does the fiscal plan working group say about that and about why we should continue to have this discussion?
Well, they have a 4-page report. I don't have it right in front of me, and I'm trying to remember, frankly, Katie, whether it speaks to oil tax reform. I think ultimately it may not have, but it was certainly, if it did, and I apologize, if it did mention it, it really just mentioned these per barrel credits. It did not talk about wholesale changes to SB 21. Now, supporters of SB 21 would say, wait a minute, the per barrel credits are part and parcel of that bill, the 2013 bill, and so that would be a wholesale change to SB 21, and they'd have some very good arguments. But the Fiscal Policy Working Group, really, its main, if somebody said, what are the two main things, the two main takeaways, maybe three, that it concluded. The first would be that it wanted to push toward a 50-50 split of the monies we take out every year from the permanent fund to finance the state. It wanted to move, quote, toward 50-50. I don't support that. It's way too generous on the dividend side. The second main thing it said was, we need a broad-based tax of $500 to $700 million. That is not an oil tax. That's really a sales tax or an income tax. The third thing, which is really super important, is that all these things should happen near simultaneously. I talk about it like the turning of the keys. You know, I'm not turning my key till you turn your key. That's really important. And you saw that in the debate this week, where Republicans, I think understandably, in the House said, look, we passed a measure yesterday or the day before, Tuesday, I guess, that said we're going to fund, it was an appropriation bill with a reduced dividend. And they understandably said, if we pass this reduced dividend, you are not going to, you other people, some Republicans, some Democrats, are not going to seriously undertake the big, difficult fiscal reforms. You're just going to go home. Well, that was legitimate. On the other hand, Democrats and some moderate Republicans said, look, if we do the large dividend, which was sought by the House minority in particular so far, we're never going to get to responsible fiscal reforms. That was equally legitimate. But the point I'm trying to make is, Katie, the keys weren't turning at the same time. You got to turn them at the same time. And we haven't figured out how to do that. And it requires trust.
So for our listeners, the fiscal plan working group report did not include oil taxes. It didn't it didn't cover that topic at all. It was just really silent on it, but that doesn't mean that it's off the table, is what I'm hearing.
That's true. That's true. For example, there's some recent movement, literally in the last 24 hours, on my bill, House Bill 104, to increase the motor fuel tax. We have the lowest one in the country, set in 1970, as I say, during the middle of the Vietnam War. That, you know, there's some recent momentum on that. That is not a fiscal policy working group idea, to my memory.
Tim, can you talk to the kind of the political calculations, considerations involved in all those trade-offs in front of us? I mean, as the representative described, how does the legislature approach really complex issues where you need to turn a bunch of keys at the same time? Has it happened before, and how would it work?
You know, Nils, I don't remember something as complicated as this ever happening before. This is really, there's so many moving pieces of this thing. I'd have to say it's almost impossible that the keys can turn at the same time. And the lack of trust is looming as a particularly large problem. The difficulty in coming together on some sort of comprehensive agreement. But that said, I mean, just the fact that the working group was able to agree on a broad paper of broad principles, and it represented all the different factions of the legislature is a pretty remarkable development. I'm hoping, and it seems to me that things are beginning to break loose a little bit in Juneau now in terms of some bills moving and some ideas moving. We may run out of time for this particular third special session, but at least things are moving in the right direction. So I'm reasonably optimistic.
Yeah.
Nils, if I can just add a couple things relating to this, we mentioned the complexity of the oil tax issues. To me, the best tax policy for whatever it's designed for is one that's very simple and transparent. Years ago, we had a relatively simple set of oil taxes. Now it's horribly complicated. And that leads to lack of transparency, suspicion that numbers are being manipulated. And I think one thing people need to think about is it would be good to get back to a system that's an oil tax system that's less complicated, that is easy for people to understand what the moving parts are. And we had that back before we went to a net profits with oil tax credits and all the different other pieces of moving parts that we have now. And so maybe we should go back in that direction just to simplify things.
Yeah. Tim, do you know what is the total government take right now? Or what is the state plus federal take on the industry? Do you know offhand?
Nils, I really can't hazard a guess that would be correct. I do know that Andy's right that the industry's oil revenue contribution to supporting the state budget has fallen dramatically, and the numbers of 30% or less industry support for the government is in the ballpark. The permanent fund is now 70% plus in support of the general fund. And the reason for that is mostly just the declining value of the oil and the declining volume of production, which is important to keep track of, that the volume of oil we're producing is 1/4 or even less of what it was when the field started up. And the prices, of course, are all over the ballpark. We're at $70 now. We were at $30 a few months ago. It's very volatile. But we've traded that for another prop to our state budget, that's financial markets, which can be equally as volatile. And even though we have a smoothing function in the way our permanent fund income calculation is a 5-year averaging, we could very easily see some real upsets in financial markets that could disrupt that pattern. The worst scenario would be an oil price collapse at the same time that there's another 2009 stock market collapse. And, you know, those sort of events are not outside the realm of possibility.
Yeah. Thanks, Tim.
Niels, one of the things that complicates this still further is that the profitability of the field is field specific. So no two fields are identical, and that makes our tax structure even more challenging to implement in a fair way.
Right. For instance, like Cook Inlet doesn't have anywhere near the same taxation system as the North Slope, right? Or
correct. And here I'm really talking about geology and access.
Okay.
You know, access to the main TAPS line, access to infrastructure, you know, the quality, the viscosity of the oil, that sort of thing.
Right. Representative, there's a question related to payment of the tax credits. And I know there's the tax credits that get deducted from payment of the tax, but there's also kind of this outstanding debt to companies. I want to say that was part of the negotiations this week, 114 million. Those things are different, and how is the legislature thinking about kind of that debt that it, you know, will still be outstanding to those companies, and what do those companies need, you know, from that obligation?
Well, so the way this worked, and I think I'm right, is that if you were an exploring company that had not yet produced, we wanted you to go do what you do well and find new development, because that was good for you and good for us. It's a win-win. And so we were literally paying cents on the dollar, sometimes quite a few cents, for their costs. And traditionally, between 2003 and 2016, I think I've got that right, whatever credit certificates they filed, we paid. So think of it like a Visa bill. You know, if you owe $1,000 on your August balance, maybe you have $1,000 and you send it to them. Well, we know that you can also send them $200, and you're within your right to do that. Now, one difference is we're not charged interest the way Visa would. But what we started to do in 2016 is make partial payments. Now, these were perfectly lawful. And then the last couple of years, and there's some dispute about, and it's complicated, about interpretation of the formula on what's due. Like I said, we used to not care about that because we would pay whatever was requested. What we did starting a few years ago is we thought that a Governor Walker plan to bond for these things would allow us to pay them all at once and then pay the debt we owed through the bond. The Supreme Court said that was an illegal bill. And so now we're back to trying to pay them as we can. I was a supporter of paying the $114 million. We owe about $700 million. These are cash credits, so these are not deductions from profit. These are cash credits. And sadly, what's happened is a number of these companies, they left town because either they weren't successful or they didn't have other sources of revenue to develop their leases, or they were waiting for these tax credits. They weren't coming, and so they couldn't stick around. And these cash credits are also transferable, so they were purchased by lenders and banks, and so now they're waiting for these credits. So what happened, and this was very strange, I think it was 2 days ago, I know it was, is that we needed, in order to pay for these credits, we were worried about using just general fund. And you should think of general fund as your savings account. We didn't think we had enough in our general fund. Again, a reflection of our own fiscal problems. So we were going to pay about half of them with general fund dollars and the other half using a source called the Constitutional Budget Reserve. Well, that requires a 30 out of 40 votes in the House to tap, to access. I thought we'd do it. The vote failed We only got 21, well short of the 30 we needed. Very ironically, my caucus provided something like 15 of the 21 yay votes to access the fund. The nay votes were 19 to get to the 40, and weirdly, the House minority provided 15 of the 19 nay votes. So I called this the world turned upside down. It made no sense from a strictly political standpoint. It was also a sign, frankly, of, lack of trust. It was very, very strange. And so what we sent to the Senate, because of the failure of half this vote, is payment of about half the tax credits. Again, this is legal because they're subject to appropriation. So we owe now, if the House version survives, I hope it sort of doesn't, I want to pay the 114. We owe $650 million. This is going to take a long time to pay. Sorry for the long explanation, but that's the answer.
No, I'm glad for the answer. I know that I've thought about it in terms of remaining school bond debt obligations, and debts are debts. So I appreciate that. Katie, what else do we have out there from folks online?
Yeah, well, we've talked a little bit about action in Juneau today, this week. Let's look to a slightly more distant past and talk about ballot measure 1 in 2020. What happened? Was the tax rate too high? Why did that fail?
Tim, any good answers?
I was going to suggest that it failed because the whole issue was so complicated that nobody understood it when they read the ballot measure. And there's a old axiom that if voters go into the voting booth and they read ballot measures that they don't understand, they vote no. I think that's what happened in the case of ballot measure 1. The issue just could not be. You just can't explain this in a bumper sticker, which is what you need with ballot measures. Does that make sense?
Yep. We're going to turn that into a bumper sticker, Tim. If it doesn't fit on this, but never mind. And Representative Josephson, any thoughts on ballot measure 1? Or?
Well, ballot measure 1 was designed to be, and I'm trying to recall its features, but it was designed to try to be simple. And there was like a 1-pager of it, but it would change the tax rates and it would change, I think, the per barrel credit. And it was a serious reform of SB 21. I think some folks wanted something even more serious. I think the public believed, and not incorrectly, that it was a second effort at the 15 or 14 effort to repeal Senate Bill 21. And there was some sort of voter fatigue with that. And then the industry used a lot of its resources to fight it. And I think that the effort to support it was weaker maybe than even the 2014-2015 referendum effort. And, I think that, the industry's argument that people they'll leave. That this is a competitive market. You want to spend your money in Azerbaijan or Alaska? There's certainly something to it. I don't fully subscribe to it. I'm sort of a middle of the roader. For example, there's evidence that ConocoPhillips is doing incredibly well in the state of Alaska. That's where it gets most of its income. So. Now, if they did less well, is that still, quote, well? I think so. So, but I think that Tim's right. I think there was voter fatigue. It was looked at as a second effort, a second bite at the apple, and that was one bite too many, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, great. We've got some time left, though I know we also have a hard stop at 1 o'clock. There are a couple of questions about, Tim, you've talked about declining production price. I mean, a lot of uncertainty and challenges still, within Alaska. I was looking at this oilprice.com article. Alaska's oil industry may be on its last legs, and I hope and don't believe that's true. But the questions that observers have are more to do with, what else should we be thinking about if the oil industry is going to have that level of uncertainty, if the state can't maybe depend on oil revenue as it has in the past, what else is everybody working on? And I know we'll address that in future sessions, but Representative Josephson, is that part of all the keys turning at once? Is it motor fuel tax and income tax and everything else? Or how would you approach that?
Yes, and as I said on the floor at a point of fatigue, I said if somebody wants me to become a 50-50 PFD acolyte, those folks need to go to a live mic and ask for a $700 million income tax. That would get my attention. That's what I said. That shows, as I said, that shows how tough a nut to crack this is. You'd have to get me on board, and I don't know that I could ever get there, with the fiscal risk of passing a 50-50 measure, which in just a few years' time would be paying $4,000 per person to Alaskans for PFDs. And you have to think of a constitutional amendment as being permanent, right? So this is sort of like Star Trek, where, I don't know if they were in the 23rd century, I don't know, but it's that sort of permanent. I don't know what my successor legislators, what problems they're going to confront. I sort of know a handful of them, but what's wrong with passing a baton to future legislators where you're actually running some modest surpluses? Why would we want to live paycheck to paycheck? So it's going to be hard to get me to 50-50, but if you don't support a broad-based tax, not only am I not there because well, I'm mostly not there because it's just fiscally irresponsible. And, and here's the problem, ladies and gentlemen. God bless the governor. You know what's coming when someone says, God bless someone. But the reality is he has said he will not sign any broad-based measure without public approval. And that just isn't required. And so he's not willing to take any risk in this game at all, none. And he's also not willing to take risk on the Delta variant. So we don't have a cooperating executive branch, and that's a big problem. And that's part of the reason for the stalemate. So, it's a real conundrum, and I'm not sure how to move forward.
So when you began, Rep. Josephson, you talked about an expanded coalition coming together around reforming the per barrel tax credit. Do you know where the governor is on that?
No, I was talking to someone about it just this morning, and I said, did the governor nix the Commissioner of Revenue's belief? And this is documented. Commissioner of Revenue said last month, I think the governor will sign a sales tax bill. And 48 hours later, he said, I won't do what my commissioner thinks I will do. And I asked an aide, was that restricted just to the sales tax? And the staffer thought, no, it was sort of for every measure. It's not even clear that he would sign my motor fuel tax bill, which would cost the average Alaskan, listen to this, it would cost the average Alaskan $50 a year. That's it. And by the way, that $50 would mostly go to making our highways and roads better. So I don't have a cooperating chief executive who's willing to look at the overall and get some skin in the game. And that's a massive problem.
Tim, can you speak to that at all? How to move forward under these circumstances?
Well, I'll say I agree with almost everything Representative Josephson said. but I want to just, I want to go back to something that deals more with the oil tax. We need to keep our eye on one of the most important goals, which is to sustain and grow oil production. The oil production is even now declining rapidly, in some of the new fields that we had hoped would come online in the next few years to soften that decline are now facing uncertainty. So I'm speaking of the Willow project, which faces major court challenges, and the Oil Surge Pekka project, which faces changes, uncertainties because of pending changes in ownership. We've got to get more money going into drilling, and how to do that is the question. I don't think you're going to see, if you raise taxes, you'll see companies leave the state. I don't think these companies will ever walk away and leave a huge vested, sunk investment. The concern is whether you can get enough new investment in drilling and new discoveries to offset that oil decline. Because remember, we could be getting down to, if we get down in the range of 300,000 barrels a day or less, we could be raising questions about the operating capability of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. Those are things we should be thinking about. So it's a difficult problem.
Let me, Marge, I'll ask you to help close us out. But Representative Josephson, Tim Bradner, thank you so much for joining us today. I know this is a complicated topic, and all the different pieces out there that are part of it. I'm hopeful that they'll come together somehow. Marge, will you help me close it out here?
Bet. Thanks everyone for joining Alaska Municipal League and AARP for part 2 of our Revenue Solutions Conversation series. We hope you'll register to continue with us for the next 3 Thursdays as we talk with legislators about potential revenue solutions. So next week, we'll visit with Representative Bart LeBon and Senator Jesse Keel on other taxes and solutions, followed by in the subsequent weeks, sales taxes and income taxes. So next week will be all of the other taxes that are out there for discussion in Alaska's revenue picture. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.